became interested in the Davis family many years ago now. It all began in 2012. We were putting together an event at the Multi-Faith Centre at the university in Derby, and we decided to include music, lots of food for people to sample. We had talks as well, but we also felt at the heart of it should be the story of the worshipping Jewish community in our city. So it was then over to me to do all the researches, and I went then to the local studies library, which at that time was in Irongate, and people were very interested and very helpful, so my researches started then. And it was as I was reading all the various books and the sources that I came across Henry Davis, who was the first president of Derby Synagogue. And there was a little bit of information about him, and that he was a member of a well-known family, the Davis family in Derby. So that, of course, set me off down a different road. And I then decided to see if I could find out more about the Davis family, almost as a second part of our exhibition. We'd taken lots of photographs, and I knew also that there might have been some photographs of the leading members of the Davis family. So I got back to the 18th century in origins, started in 1779, because in that year a man called Gabriel Davis came over from Germany and settled in Leeds, and he was a manufacturer of mathematical, optical and surveying instruments, obviously a very skillful man with his workforce. And he had a nephew who was called John, and John was born in Thame, but he was apprenticed down in London and eventually came to join his uncle Gabriel's business in Leeds. In those days, any of these manufacturing businesses evidently had people who would travel to other cities so that they could then set up a temporary shop or stall and sell the merchandise there. So that's what happened in the case of the Davis family. Nephew John was sent off on his travels to places like Liverpool, Newcastle, I understand, as well, and eventually he came to Derby. And he obviously saw the potential here because of the mills and the industries in the 18th and 19th centuries. So he set up a temporary shop, I suppose the equivalent of a pop-up store nowadays, like we have in the Guildhall market at the moment, and set up a temporary shop in what was then called Rotten Row, which is now in the Market Square in Derby, in what would have been, I assume, where the assembly rooms is and was. So that was his shop there, and he evidently did very well, and he went to and fro back to his uncle's business in Leeds. At this point, it was the time when the railways were coming to Derby, and he obviously again saw the potential. So although he was backwards and forwards to Leeds quite a lot, eventually he decided to settle in Derby. And he seems at that point to have broken away from his uncle's business in Leeds and to have decided to manufacture goods along the same lines, but in Derby. And so he rented and then bought a property in Irongate, 21 Irongate, opposite Derby Cathedral. A wonderful building which is still there to this day. It was the Manor townhouse, and one would assume goes back to Tudor times in origin. It was at one time a wonderful Italian restaurant, but at the moment, as far as I know, it is empty. But the building is still there and well worth a visit to see from the outside. So that's where he and his family lived, and where also there was a workshop for optical surveying, instruments later on, telescopes, instruments like stethoscopes, things that were used by miners and in the mills. It was going in all sorts of different directions. and of course the workforce was expanded at the same time. And so although the family home was still in the same place in Irongate, he eventually set up a workshop in Armen Alley, which is the narrow road between Fall Street and Irongate that runs alongside Derby Cathedral. So that was a very busy hub of the industry, and we have old photographs to show all the machinery in that workshop. It was on the corner. I think it's nowadays part of a car park, but that's the origins of the Davis family workshop. So John was the founder in Derby, and his son Henry eventually came to help his father in his business, and eventually he took over. And Henry seems to have had even wider dreams and hopes, a real entrepreneur, one would assume nowadays. And he travelled, and evidently he went all around the world, and sometime during his travels he met his future wife, and they both came back to settle in Derby. And he also set up agencies in other countries like Australia, Canada, South Africa. So the goods from Derby were going out to all different parts of the world and were being used in mines and in manufacturing industries worldwide. So a real hub of worldwide trade at that time. He obviously was doing very well because the family moved out from the house in Irongate to a very large, imposing house in Friargate in Derby, which you can still see to this day, a very imposing house, very near to the Handyside Bridge across the road. So that's where they lived and no doubt entertained, but the workshop was still the hub in Armen Alley. This was, of course, Victorian times, and we know that when Queen Victoria visited Derby, it was the Davis firm that supplied electrical illuminations to the city to entertain the Queen at that time. They also set up electricity generating facilities for the mines and no doubt for the factories as well. So they were really diversifying. And Henry Davis at that time also was obviously following his faith, the family faith. They were a Jewish family. Gabriel was Jewish, and we know that his grandfather had been a rabbi. So there was always that Jewish connection. The worshipping community was eventually to form an actual building where they met for worship and for meetings. But before they purchased the site in Burton Road, they were worshipping, of course, in different places in Derby. And Henry was elected the first president of the synagogue in Derby. So obviously a very well respected man, as well as being a businessman. He had a son called Arthur. And Arthur, in a way, continued partly in the family business, but had his other interests as well. He was a scholar, and he taught himself Hebrew, and was a remarkable scholar because he translated the Hebrew festival prayer book from Hebrew into English. And at our events at the Multi-Faith Centre back in 2013, it was very moving for one of the rabbis who was there to bring along a copy of that prayer book, still sometimes in use to this day, and to show us all. And we had that wonderful link with the Davis family because of that at that event. So Arthur, going down a different road, a scholarly road, but also a very important man in his own right. He had moved eventually out of Derby, and he married, had a family, and in the family was a daughter called Nina Ruth Davis. She married a Mr. Salomon, and Nina Ruth Davis Salomon eventually became a scholar in her own right. She was a poet, a very talented poet. I've come across her poems myself, and we've used them in Derby. Very atmospheric, very thoughtful poems about the age in which she was living. And also she was a translator of many different Hebrew sources and books, and had the great honour of being the very first woman in the UK to preach at an Orthodox synagogue. So it's a remarkable family. It's amazing, I think, that my studies started with trying to find out about the synagogue, led me to Henry, and then the rest is history, really, because it took me down all sorts of exciting roads. It took me for a long time to piece together all of that history, and the research into their past continues. This is a poem by Nina Ruth Davis Salomon, and is called In the Synagogue. 'Tis long, long since your sweet and wistful singing melted my heart and moulded it anew. Now on the tide of years I drift to you, the same heart bringing. And in this moment, lo, I stand again upon the brink of life, and in my ears that same lone sound of singing full of tears, like twilight, shimmering, mystical, glad like the day, and like the darkness, fain to lavish all its wealth of balm and soothe an age-long pain. Here in the gleam of re-arisen years, my spirit leaps to meet some form akin, and memory stirs and wakes, and deep within me, something whispers low, knowest thou thy heart? And I make silent answer, yea, I know. The heart once lighted by these glories grew into their form, took on their glowing hue, and all the years has stood awake, apart, yearning to greet its vanished haunts anew. So, having sought mine olden wonders long, I come to you. I come to you and find them in your song.